Based on the patterns of American withdrawals and limited responses to attacks during the late 20th century, Osama bin Laden reached a conclusion that would shape al-Qaeda's strategy for years to come. Looking at events such as the Vietnam War, the Iran hostage crisis, the Beirut barracks bombing, the withdrawal from Somalia after the Black Hawk Down incident, and the relatively restrained responses to earlier terrorist attacks, bin Laden became convinced that the United States lacked the political will to sustain a long and costly fight against determined adversaries. In bin Laden's view, America possessed overwhelming military power but was unwilling to accept significant casualties or prolonged conflict. He believed that democratic governments were particularly vulnerable because public opinion could pressure leaders to end unpopular wars. To him, each American withdrawal or limited military response appeared to confirm the idea that the United States would eventually retreat if the human, political, or financial costs became too high. This belief became a central assumption behind al-Qaeda's strategy. Bin Laden expected that a dramatic attack on the United States would intimidate American leaders, weaken public support for overseas involvement, and ultimately force the country to withdraw from the Middle East. As a result, when al-Qaeda carried out the attacks of September 11, 2001, its leaders anticipated that the United States would react much as they believed it had in previous crises, by reducing its commitments and avoiding a prolonged confrontation. Instead, the response was dramatically different. President George W. Bush declared a global campaign against terrorism, launched military operations in Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban government that had sheltered al-Qaeda, and committed the United States to a long-term effort to dismantle terrorist networks around the world. The scale and duration of the American response surprised bin Laden, who had expected a more limited reaction. Even so, bin Laden continued to believe that democracies had difficulty sustaining lengthy wars. He hoped that, over time, casualties, financial costs, and public fatigue would erode American commitment and eventually lead the United States to disengage. This belief remained a core element of al-Qaeda's strategy throughout the years that followed, influencing both its rhetoric and its ongoing efforts to wage a prolonged conflict against the United States and its allies. Islamist extremist organizations differ significantly from earlier nationalist terrorist movements in both their goals and their understanding of the conflict. While many 20th century nationalist groups sought specific political objectives, such as independence, territorial control, or regime change, Islamist extremists frame their struggle in religious terms and believe it is commanded by God. According to their ideology, jihad is not simply a political tool, but a religious duty. These groups argue that Muslims are obligated to work toward the expansion of Islam and the establishment of societies governed by their interpretation of Islamic law. As a result, they view their actions as part of a larger religious mission rather than a conventional political campaign. Many Islamist extremists also hold apocalyptic beliefs about history and the future. They contend that the ultimate triumph of Islam is a necessary step in God's plan for humanity, and that important end-times events, including the final judgment, cannot occur until Islam has achieved global victory. Because they see themselves as participating in a divinely ordained struggle, they often view compromise, negotiation, and political concessions as unacceptable. This worldview distinguishes Islamist extremism from earlier forms of terrorism rooted primarily in nationalism, ethnicity, or political ideology. For many extremist groups, the conflict is not merely about territory or government policy. It is understood as part of a broader religious struggle that they believe has cosmic significance and eternal consequences. In contrast, the military responses of Western nations often appeared limited, cautious, and restrained from the perspective of Islamist extremists. Democratic governments typically weighed military action against political costs, public opinion, legal considerations, and the risk of civilian casualties. As a result, interventions were often conducted with specific objectives and time limits rather than as open-ended conflicts. Islamist extremists interpreted this restraint very differently. Because they viewed themselves as participants in a divinely ordained struggle, they believed they possessed advantages that conventional armies lacked. They argued that they had unlimited time to pursue their goals, since their cause extended beyond any single generation. They claimed to have no fear of death because they regarded martyrdom as a reward rather than a sacrifice. Most importantly, they maintained absolute confidence in the righteousness of their mission, believing that they were carrying out God's will and that ultimate victory was guaranteed. This mindset created a profound challenge for governments attempting to combat such organizations. Traditional methods of deterrence, compromise, and negotiation were often less effective against opponents who saw the conflict in religious and eternal terms rather than political ones. As a result, many security experts and policymakers viewed these groups as especially dangerous. Their willingness to endure setbacks, accept heavy losses, and continue fighting for years or even decades made them difficult adversaries in the global struggle against terrorism. Many extremist organizations that emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries were either directly connected to al-Qaeda or heavily influenced by its ideology. Rather than operating only within a single country, these groups established networks across multiple regions, taking root wherever governments were weak, political instability existed, or populations were receptive to their message. In many cases, they received training, financial assistance, weapons, or ideological support from outside sponsors. Governments, such as Iran and Syria, were frequently accused of supporting various militant organizations as part of broader efforts to expand their regional influence, challenge rivals, or weaken Western interests in the Middle East. Over time, the targets of these extremist movements expanded significantly. Initially, many Islamist groups focused their efforts on Israel, which they viewed as an illegitimate state occupying Muslim land. As their ideology evolved, they increasingly identified the United States as a primary enemy because of its support for Israel, its military presence in the Middle East, and its influence on regional politics. From there, their hostility broadened further to include Western democracies in general, which they portrayed as political, cultural, and military obstacles to their objectives. Eventually, many of these organizations came to regard not only Western nations, but also Muslims who disagreed with them, secular governments, religious minorities, and virtually anyone who opposed their vision of society as legitimate targets. Their ultimate goal extended far beyond local political grievances. They sought to replace existing political systems with governments based on their extremist interpretation of Islamic law and, in some cases, envisioned a global order organized according to those principles. This evolution marked a significant departure from earlier terrorist movements. Whereas many 19th and 20th century terrorist groups pursued specific national or political objectives, modern jihadist organizations increasingly embraced a broader ideological and religious mission. As a result, their struggle expanded from regional disputes into a global campaign against what they perceived as forces standing in the way of their vision for the future. For many years, a common theory among some Western scholars and policymakers was that terrorism was primarily the product of poverty, economic inequality, and a lack of opportunity. According to this interpretation, individuals turned to terrorism because they felt excluded from economic progress and had few alternatives for improving their lives. If poverty and deprivation were the root causes of terrorism, then improving education, expanding economic opportunities, and raising living standards would reduce the appeal of extremist movements. However, research on many modern terrorist organizations, particularly jihadist groups, has challenged this explanation. Studies of the September 11, 2001, hijackers found that most did not come from the poorest segments of society. Approximately 70% came from middle or upper-class families in their home countries, and about half had attended college, often studying technical or professional fields such as engineering. The average age of the attackers was about 24, indicating that they were generally young, educated adults rather than impoverished individuals with no prospects. Osama bin Laden himself was not poor. He was born into one of the wealthiest and most influential families in Saudi Arabia. These findings suggest that modern jihadist terrorism cannot be explained simply as a revolt of the poor against the rich. While economic conditions may influence some conflicts, many participants in extremist movements are motivated by factors that go beyond material hardship. Researchers have pointed to the importance of radical ideology, religious extremism, feelings of political or cultural humiliation, and beliefs that the existing international order is unjust or illegitimate. For many jihadist groups, the central motivation is not economic advancement, but the pursuit of ideological and religious goals. Their members are often driven by a conviction that they are participating in a struggle with profound moral or spiritual significance. As a result, terrorism is frequently fueled less by poverty than by a combination of extremist beliefs, perceived grievances, group identity, and a desire to transform society according to a particular ideological vision. The emergence of what many scholars call the new terrorists marked a significant departure from earlier forms of political violence. Unlike many 19th and 20th century terrorist movements, which were primarily nationalist, separatist, or revolutionary in nature, these organizations were driven by a broader ideological and religious vision. Their motivation was not rooted primarily in economic concerns or demands for material improvement, but in deeply held theological and ideological beliefs. Members of these movements viewed themselves as participants in a global religious mission. They sought nothing less than the transformation of society on a worldwide scale. Their goals included the destruction of what they regarded as the corrupting influence of Western civilization, the overthrow of secular governments throughout the Muslim world, and the establishment of a global political and social order based on their own interpretation of Islamic law and religious principles. Because they believed their cause was divinely sanctioned, these extremists often rejected the political compromises that characterize conventional diplomacy. Negotiation, incremental reform, and coexistence were frequently seen as unacceptable because they fell short of the comprehensive transformation the movements desired. In their view, the struggle was not simply about changing specific government policies or resolving territorial disputes. It was about remaking the world according to an ideological and religious vision. Many adherents also emphasized personal sacrifice and rejected the pursuit of wealth, comfort, and material success as life's primary goals. At the same time, they readily embraced modern technology when it advanced their cause. Weapons, communication systems, video production, the internet, and other technological tools became important instruments for recruitment, propaganda, coordination, and violence. For these organizations, the ultimate objective was not compromise or a negotiated settlement with their opponents. Instead, they sought a sweeping transformation of political, cultural, and social life. This revolutionary vision distinguished the new generation of jihadist movements from many earlier terrorist organizations whose goals had been more limited, localized, or political in scope. The rise of religiously motivated terrorism presents one of the most significant challenges of the modern era. Unlike many earlier terrorist movements, which sought limited political objectives such as national independence or territorial concessions, many contemporary extremist organizations pursue far broader ideological goals. Driven by radical interpretations of religion, they seek not merely to influence governments, but to fundamentally transform societies and reshape the world according to their beliefs. This development raises a series of difficult questions for the 21st century. Can open and democratic societies sustain long-term campaigns against extremist movements that view themselves as engaged in an endless struggle? How can governments provide security for their citizens while preserving the civil liberties and freedoms that define democratic systems? Will economic globalization, increased communication, and greater international interconnectedness reduce conflict by creating shared interests? Or will these forces intensify feelings of cultural, political, and religious alienation that can contribute to radicalization? Another challenge concerns the ability of nations to contain political and religious extremism in a world where ideas, money, technology, and people can move across borders more easily than ever before. Modern extremist organizations often operate through international networks, using global communications to recruit supporters, spread propaganda, and coordinate activities across multiple countries. This interconnected environment makes the fight against terrorism more complex than conflicts confined to a single nation or region. No one can predict with certainty what the greatest threat of the 21st century will ultimately be. Yet, the persistence of terrorism demonstrates that the danger cannot be explained solely by poverty or economic hardship. In many cases, modern terrorism is driven by radical ideologies, religious extremism, perceived grievances, and revolutionary visions of social transformation. As a result, the struggle against terrorism is likely to remain not only a military and security challenge, but also an ideological one. The central question facing modern civilization is therefore not simply how to defeat terrorist organizations, but how free societies can remain secure, preserve their values, and maintain their resilience in the face of movements committed to fundamentally changing the existing world order.